What's up, people of YouTube? I am bringing you the ultimate 2026 Fair Frog Sideboard Companion. Now, what does that mean? It is not a sideboard guide. If you're looking for a bring in X, take out X sideboard guide, just straight mapping, this is not going to be the video for you. But if you're wanting to learn tips and tricks for sideboarding that have helped me in a lot of popular modern matchups to get ready for maybe one of your RCQs coming up, then this will help you kind of cater your sideboarding to your particular list. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to pick the top 10 decks on Goldfish. These are all decks with at least a 3% meta share, and we're going to go through each one of them and talk sideboarding across 3 different lists. First off, we're going to do sideboarding for all of the Dimir Frog, like the mid-range fair decks. These are often characterized with cards like Quantum Riddler, with Tamiyo, Psychic Frog, stuff like that. We're going to do the Flash build. So this is actually not a Psychic Frog deck, but is extremely popular at the moment. We're going to talk sideboarding tips and tricks for it. And then as a bit of a bonus, I'm going to throw in Oculus as well, the combo-esque reanimator build of Dimir. Now, to note, all 3 of these lists have a good bit of overlap, but the gameplay differences are fairly substantial. So we'll talk about how the gameplay kind of interacts with that sideboarding philosophy, how they intersect. So keep an eye out for that. So let's go ahead and hop in with our first matchup and get to it. All right, the very first matchup we're going over, Boros Energy, definitely one of the most, if not the most popular deck in Modern. Probably going to see it a lot in your RCQs, so get ready for it. From the Dimir sideboarding side, or from the Dimir side in general, you're definitely the control deck. You're trying to mitigate some of the early pressure, use that to pivot into some of your value producing mid to late game threats and take over the late game with permission with your interaction. But what does that actually look like? From the Boros side, the starts that are the most scary for us are the aggressive creature starts, like 1-drop into double 1-drop into a Johnny plus something. Those kind of starts get out of hand very, very quickly. So it's important from the Dimir side to think about that when we're planning out our sideboard map. So for example, cards that I'm most likely to bring out in the matchup are Thoughtseize, some number of Force and Negation. Force can be decent to help out against Goblin Bombardment, Blood Moon, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Legend of Roku, stuff like that are all very common inclusions in the Boros 75s. But you don't want to be Force and Negation flooded. Galvanic Discharge can be a little bit of an awkward target. Thraben Charm, not great. When Boros used to be on more static prisons, I was a lot happier with Force Negation, but nowadays you might see like 1 static prison every now and then, so it's not too much of a consideration. On the draw, Counterspell can be a little bit slow. Like I mentioned, there's 1-drop into double 1-drop hands. Really do a good job of getting under Counterspell. You can't really afford to hold it up at that point. So it's a card that you can consider trimming on the draw. Kaito a lot of times comes out because you're not connecting with it. Too many tokens on the ground, too many bodies to stop you from ninjutsuing in. Cards like Quantum Riddler, you might trim an extra copy of. Murktide Regent, a little bit slow. Tamiyo, really bad, especially on the draw, because you don't want to let your opponent play out like a turn 1 Ragavan. You play Tamiyo, they discharge, get in an attack, play a 2-drop. You just set yourself way behind. So not putting that out there is usually the better play. And if you're not going to play it out on turn 1, why have it in your deck? It is a little bit better on the play. So a summation, Thoughtseize, Force and Negation, really weak. Kaito, really weak. Tamiyo, really weak, especially on the draw. On the play, I might consider leaving in either Tamiyo or like a couple copies of Thoughtseize, because you can have a turn 1 Thoughtseize on the play to disrupt one of those early 1-drops, give yourself a chance to hold up 2 mana on 2 without falling behind to like a Ragavan or a and Ocelot Pride. Just kind of gives you Fatal Push copies 5 through whatever in those cases. The board ends, Engineered Explosives, obviously great. Like any sort of Wrath effect, whether it be Engineered Explosives, Toxic Deluge, if you're splashing white for Pest Control, if you're splashing red for Fire Magic, anything like that, really, really good. Any Grave Hate, if it's, I say Grave Hate if it's value oriented. So for example, Nihil Spellbomb, taking out Flage and drawing a card, Strategic Betrayal, taking out a creature, exiling the yard to stop Flage escapes. I'm not as big a fan of just like one of exile effects. So for example, if you had like Soul Guide Lantern, that you have to wait for the Flage to enter, then hit the Flage, and then you can't exile the yard and draw a card. So it's a little bit less value oriented. Less a fan of those. Kind of the same thing with Surgical. If you have Surgical, you're probably bringing it in, but I'm not. It's like lower on my list than Nihil Spellbomb or Ghost Vacuum or some like Graveyard Trespasser, some piece like that that just gets more value than simply exiling the Flage and only the Flage. I mentioned Pest Control if you're splashing white, Fire Magic, Pyroclasm, stuff like that. If you're splashing red, are all options that are coming in. You're just trying to, again, embrace that control route. Like your opponent's going to get on the board early. You need to be prepared to deal with those fast starts. It's really more about mulliganing effectively than it is about the cards that you're bringing out of the sideboard. Like if your opening hand, especially if you're on the draw, doesn't answer a 1-drop, throw that hand back. You can't afford to get overrun before you have a chance to do anything. If you're on the play, it can be a lot more lenient because a turn 2 Psychic Frog on the play, for example, can stand in front of just about everything. So it can be really nice to just stock or create a roadblock. That's the word. Create a roadblock. From the flash side, not a whole lot to board out in a matchup like this. Most of your main deck is like fairly geared towards these Boros Energy and Jeskai Blink style decks anyway. Fire Magic is a card that's getting splashed for a lot right now. Fire Magic and like Meltdown. Obviously, you're not bringing in Meltdown against Boros, but Fire Magic, just like the fair mid-range list, really, really good. Graveyard Trespasser. I've seen lists going up to like 3 copies of Graveyard Trespasser in the board. Another really good one. Engineered Explosives, Toxic Deluge again, Damnation, anything like that. Board out against Boros, you're usually lower on like force negation effects and flash than you are in the fair builds, but you still could trim some number of those. I've heard plenty of people interested in trimming on cards like Shieldred's Edict, because if your opponent's playing a bunch of 1-drops, then you might not get to hit the target that you want. I can see trimming on Shieldred's Edict on the draw. I probably wouldn't on the play when you can hit their 1-drop. I usually just like to keep every piece of spot removal I have access to in Wan Shi Tong. You don't want to get Wan Shi Tong flooded, so trimming like the 4th copy is okay. Kaito getting trimmed is okay. Again, Counterspell on the draw could be a little slow. Consult the star charts on the draw could be a little bit slow. Really just depends on like how many Wrath effects you're bringing in. Typically, the flash decks are bringing in Wraths and Grave Hates, like Wraths and Graveyard Trespass or something like that. So being more Wrath, untap, put something on the board that kind of regains board control in your favor is a little bit more of the flash plan, where the Dimir Frog plan is a little bit more about getting a threat down plus a piece of interaction and using that threat to accrue some amount of advantage. And then finally, Dimir Oculus. Same sideboard outs that you've kind of heard from the other lists, like Force Negation's a bit weaker. You could trim like an Unearth and an Oculus because of cards like Thraben Charm. If you know your opponent's bringing in Ghost Vacuums or an extensive amount of Grave Hate, you might want to go down another Unearth. I usually try to trim Unearths before I trim Oculus, because if your opponent wants to stop Oculus, then they just have to like preemptively hit your graveyard, which a lot of times isn't great. But if they want to stop Unearth and they respond to the Unearth with a Grave Effect piece, then that can be really big as like a blowout on your side. So I'd rather make them just throw away their Grave Hate to stop something that I haven't put on the stack yet, or just set it up to where I'm able to overpower like a Ghost Vacuum and Hardcast Inoculus anyway. So trimming on Unearths, trimming on Thought Seizes. I don't like to cut all of my Thought Seizes in this matchup with Oculus, because it's really nice to have the option to say on the play, land, go, your opponent plays like a tap land, go back to your turn, Thought Seize yourself, discard an Oculus, unearth it, here's a 5/5, go. Games like that can really let you steal some percentage points against Boros. So taking out Force Negation in some number, trimming on Unearth, trimming on Thought Seize, maybe trimming on an Oculus if the Grave Hate is that extensive. Sideboarding in, again, Engineered Explosives, heard that a million times. Grave Hate, Nihil Spellbomb, Surgical Extraction, whatever the case may be. And then I'll bring in a Harbinger of the Seas on the play against Boros. I don't bring it in against them on the draw. It's very, very easy for Boros to play around Harbinger. So you do have to be a little bit careful, but it's nice to have those occasional oops, I win games where they just went like Elegant Parlor into basic planes, and you just shut them off of red completely. So keep an eye out for those moments. Just try not to telegraph Harbinger if you're bringing it in. Don't be like, oh, I'm going to fetch up Basic Island on 1, Basic Swamp on 2 for a frog, Basic Island on 3. But if your opponent is playing like Blood Moon effects, you got to be respectful of that. So that's it for like list specific sideboarding. Let's get to some of the philosophy of sideboarding against Boros. We already mentioned that the creature starts are very problematic. The other problematic part is when you get too ingrained on stopping the creature starts with like spell snares and stern scoldings, which if you have stern scoldings, obviously you're bringing him in, but you get too caught up in that and you lose to Blood Moon and Legend of Roku and Escape Flagellate. So you've got to keep in mind what your specific list is trying to do. So for example, Oculus, the key is always to get a threat on the battlefield and let that threat snowball. So it's really important to keep hands that have the ability to produce a threat and not just try to play the control route, because eventually your opponent will overrun your interaction. From the Fair Frog side, you can do a much better job of playing the control route because you have cards like Orcish Bowmaster and Subtlety that kind of double as interaction plus a threat. And you have Quantum Riddler to let you throw stuff out aggressively. Use Quantum Riddler to start refilling your hand. Cling to Dust is like a value draw spell that can also stop Flage, regain some life. And then the Flash deck is like the all-in control route. Like, I'm going to do everything I can to counter your stuff, control the board, remove your threats, and then eventually drop like a Wan Shi Tong for 4 or whatever. Draw a couple cards, make you deal with this. Here's another Wan Shi Tong or Snapcaster Toxic Deluge, and kind of run away with the game that way just by running your opponent out of resources. The other lists don't really care so much about running out of resources. Some other cards to keep in mind from the Boros side. Celestial Purge is very, very popular, so your Psychic Frog isn't always safe. I've seen Boros players bring in Prismatic Ending. I didn't even know that they ran that card until somebody got me with one recently. Legend of Roku, I mentioned. Blood Moon, very popular. Wrath of Skies, if you're on like an Oculus build. Usually they're not bringing in Wrath against a fair build or a flash build, but I've seen Boros players bring in Wrath of Skies against Oculus because Wrathing for 3 isn't the most crazy thing in the world. Surgical Extraction or Ghost Vacuum if you're on Oculus. And that's kind of about it. Usually their board outs are some number of like Galvanic Discharge, Mana Tithe, depending on your build. Thraben Charm might come out against Flash or the Fair build and stay in against Oculus. If they're on the draw, Ragavan might come out in some number. But really the goal is, again, just stymie some of that early pressure, try to get down something that's going to allow you to snowball if you're on Oculus or Fair Frog, or get to a Wrath effect and then into a card advantage source if you're on the Flash build. That's it for Boros. Let's get on to the next one. Matchup number 2, Jeskai Blink. Blue, red, white, Blink, America Blink, whatever we're calling this deck. The Ragavan, Felia, Flage, Quantum Riddler, Consigned Memory, Solitude deck, blah, 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 blah. You've all seen it a million times ever since it had its breakout at Houston. It's been arguably just as popular as Boros. I think the percentages have been a little bit lower in terms of total number of like 5-0s in the leagues, but I'd be willing to bet the top 8 numbers are fairly close. Top 32, day 2 conversions, all that stuff, extremely popular. So another deck that you're very likely to run into in a good bit of your RCQs and need to know how to approach the matchup. So again, from the Demir side, or the blue black X fair side for sideboarding, and I'm gonna get a little bit less rambly as the matchups go on. Now that you kind of seen what the thought process is, we're gonna get a lot more into, I'm assuming you know what a traditional Jeskai Blink deck list looks like, you know the cards, so let's get more into the this is the in, this is the out, this is the thought process of the different archetypes of fair frog, and I guess fair non-frog with flash. So Jeskai Blink, some of the stuff I'm looking at taking out against Jeskai. Force negation, I pretty much cut entirely, because cards like Consigned to Memory can be replicated, Ephemerate can be instant speed, a lot of their interaction is instant speed. It's really only good into like Teferi exactly, but you still have Thought Seizes, you still have counter spells, you're bringing in mystical disputes. So Force negation, I think, gets a pretty quick cut on my end. I also like to bring out Murktide Regent as just a card that gets like 1-for-1 by Solitude very easily. Your graveyard is not an infinite resource, and cards like Cling to Dust, I think, are a lot more valuable for exiling Flages, for being a late game draw engine, and I just don't want Murktide to be, again, like 1-for-1 by a Solitude that sticks around, or worse, bounced by a Teferi. Either one of those makes me absolutely cringe. So looking at Thought Seizes, looking at Murktides, or any other just big vanilla threat. And then Spell Snare. Spell Snare, I used to think at one point or another was going to be really impactful into Jeskai Blink, but they've cut down on like total numbers of prismatic endings, and now it's just Felia. Felia is like the only 2-drop in the 75 that is in post board, and you don't want to be stuck with a bunch of Spell Snares in hand against Warped Riddlers or Casey Jones or anything like that. So Spell Snare, Force negation, Murktide Regent typically coming out, or some number of cards like that. My board ends any number of Kaitos that you have access to in the 75. I've said it on stream a million times, and I'll say it a million more. Kaito is pretty much the only card in our 75 that has the potential to just solo this matchup. So any Kaitos you have that you can bring in, this is like one of, if not the best matchup for them. Mystical Disputes coming in, great to be able to counter a Warped Riddler on 3 so they can't consign it or ephemerate it. Great against Teferi, great against their Mystical Disputes that they're bringing in for us. Just hits a lot of relevant pieces. And then worst case scenario, you can use it as like a bad mana leak against an Escaped Flage. It is expensive mana wise, but if they're spending 4 and you're spending 3, you're still up on that exchange, especially if you can combine it with like holding up another Dispute or something. So Dispute definitely coming in. Harbinger of the Seas, I'll usually bring in like 1, maybe 2. Harbinger is a little bit awkward in Solitude matchups because, yes, they have a free way to get Harbinger off the battlefield, but if they don't see Solitude, A lot of times you can cut them off some pretty impactful plays. Like if you can set up in most of these matches with Blue Black X versus Jeskai, both players know that the game is going to be going long and they want to set up their early draws. They want to start filtering early. So people are getting surveils in their first few turns. They're typically not getting basics. So if you have the option to like slow roll a Harbinger a little bit, Thoughtseize to clear the way for Solitude, or have Stern Scolding or something up, and get down a Harbinger, a lot of times you can shut off like Flage entirely, or especially Escape Flage, cut off Casey Jones, cut off Wrath the Skies if they brought that in. A lot of their double pip cards because they don't really have that many basics. So it is a card to keep an eye out for. Stern Scoldings, if you have those, are usually coming in. Bragavan, Felia, Solitude, all really good targets for that. I've seen people play Strict Serenade. This is a good matchup for that if you got it in the sideboard. And then Consigned to Memory. I might bring in like 2 Consigned to Memories for fighting over Solitude Evokes, especially if you're on the Harbinger plan, or fighting over something like a Flage ETB, sometimes Quantum Riddler, if it's just a Quantum Riddler off the top or something. So it's not a card that I'm heavily reliant on, but it's a nice one to have access to post board if you have the room to board in a couple more cards. And Graveyard Trespasser, if you have Trespasser, this is a good matchup for it as well. Usually not a big fan of sweeper effects because like Toxic Deluge is really awkward into Flage or into Quantum Riddler, just a lot of mana to spend. But being able to bring in a little bit of Grave Hate for Flage, obviously nice. In the Flash builds, Graveyard Trespasser, Mystical Dispute, kind of the same idea. Like Force Negation's not great, Spell Snare's not great. Graveyard Trespasser, Mystical Dispute are great. Everything else about your deck is pretty much on par. Children's Edict's really, really good against the Blink stuff. From the Oculus side, this is a pretty bad matchup for Oculus because Quantum Riddler is big enough to stand in front of your Oculus, and you might get to make a 2/2, but they're getting to draw 2 cards, and their 2 cards often equate into like Flages and Solitudes and stuff that your 2/2 body is not very good against. So you have to be careful of being too reliant on Oculus itself. Strategic Betrayal, great. Some of the board outs, Force Negation, just like the other matchups. Spell Snare, just like the other matchups. But the board ends, I'm a little bit harder on Harbinger of the Seas post board out of the Oculus builds. Like you really need that unfair element in this matchup. So being able to oops into like a Thought Scour over Unearth a Harbinger can be a really big deal. Especially if you've got a card like Vexing Bauble in your sideboard. Harbinger plus Vexing Bauble can be really, really good at shutting down a lot of good starts out of Jeskai, a lot of Solitude starts, and it makes it very one-dimensional. It makes, if you're able to get down an early Harbinger against Jeskai with like Stern Scolding or something to fight over Solitude, it becomes Quantum Riddler is like the only thing that you care about, and you can start leveraging your Thoughtseizes and counter spells and Mystical Disputes and stuff to fight over exactly Quantum Riddler and not care so much about the rest of the deck. So you have elements to win, you just have to be a little bit careful there. So from the gameplay perspective, or I guess from the Jeskai Blink sideboard, they're bringing in like Strict Serenade if they have it, Celestial Purge, extra copies of Teferi Time Reveler, Mystical Dispute. Pretty common sideboard cards. They don't really get anything too tricky, too crazy. Post board, depending on the build, it could become a value game. If you're on like fair mid-range Frog, it's all about Kaito. Find Kaito, get Kaito down, stop their Riddlers, warp your Riddlers. So just trying to win the card advantage war. And if you can win the card advantage war, you have a really good chance of winning the match. With the Flash build, you're a little bit better into Blink because you don't have to tap out. And at the end of the day, all of their big plays are sorcery speed. So warping a Riddler into Consign or Ephemerate, or escaping Flage. You don't care about Solitude nearly as much. So you get to keep applying pressure on their instep when they're not as good at interacting with you. So definitely one of the better matchups for Grixis Flash. And then Oculus, again, about trying to set up an unfair angle. Thoughtseize to get to an Unearthed Oculus or Unearthed Graveyard Trespasser, Hardcast Harbinger, whatever the case may be, just to try to put enough pressure to close the game out extraordinarily quick with Oculus, or set up to where your opponent can't win the game with Harbinger Lockout. Graveyard Trespasser getting flipped into a 4/4 is a really big deal, so you can avoid Flage. If they're on like Galvanic Discharge, they likely don't have extra energy stored away, so you can survive Discharge, you can survive Flage. That helps out a ton. And yeah, I think that's about it for that matchup. Dreams of Steel and Oil, if you have it in the sideboard, is pretty good. Mentioned Mystical Dispute, Stern Scolding, any extra copies of Edict effects. Like Shieldred's Edict is the best removal spell in the matchup because you can hit a Quantum Riddler in response to an Ephemerate or something along those lines. You can hit Teferi Time Reveler. It's a big deal. So if you have Shieldred's Edict, definitely bringing those in. And that's about it for Blink. Let's get on to matchup number 3. Before we get on to the third matchup, remember, if you are enjoying this content, enjoying the commentary, consider leaving a like on the video, maybe even subscribe to the channel. Greatly appreciate it. Helps to hit all of our growth metrics. Other than that, we'll have all the links to the Dimir, the Fair Frog, the Oculus, the Flash list all over on my Mox field. Link to the Mox field is down below in the description, so feel free to check that out if you need some inspiration coming up for any of your events. Anyway, let's get back to the matchups. Matchup number 3 is Mono Red or Ruby Storm. Definitely one that's going to have a lot less to talk about. Fairly good matchup for all flavors of Dimir or Blue Black X in general. Counter spells plus pressure go a long way. It is going to depend on the build a good bit, and I'll get into what I mean by that as we go through the different archetypes. From the Fair Dimir Frog side, sideboarding out, usually some amount of spot removal, so like Shieldred's Edicts are pretty easy cut on to me. And then I'll board out like 1, maybe 2 Fatal Push. Yes, Ral exists as a magic card, but you still have spell snares, counter spells, thought seizes, subtleties in this case. So you have a good bit of interaction for Ral. And I don't want to be clogged up on Fatal Pushes when I need spell-based interaction. So, couple Fatal Push, couple Shieldred's, or all the Shieldred's Edicts. What else? Maybe like a Bowmaster if you're just wanting to be a little more lean. Cards I'm boarding in. Any Grave Hate, Ghost Vacuum, Surgical Extraction, Nihil Spellbomb, anything like that. I'll probably bring in extra Kaito just because if you can get down a card advantage engine with a free spell backup, so a Force Negation or Force Subtlety, something like that, it can go a long way towards helping you like solidify your board position. I'll almost always bring in 1 copy of some sort of sweeper effect, whether that be a single Engineered Explosives, a Toxic Deluge, Pest Control, Pyroclasm, Fire Magic, whatever. If it's either closed deck list or I know my opponent is on some number of Empty the Warrens. You just don't want to be got with literal no outs to your opponent like Ritual, Manamorphose, Empty the Warrens, because you were playing around a Past in Flames or something. So I would almost always bring in 1 copy of some sort of sweeper if you have access to it, unless it's really bad. Like I'm not bringing in Damnation against Storm, but I'll bring in like Engineered Explosives because worst case scenario, I can EE away a. This is where contextually is really important. I can EE away a Ral or Ruby Medallion worst case scenario. I can cycle a pest control. I can Toxic Deluge away a Ral or some spawn tokens off of like the 3-mana card, the Glimpse the Impossible. So those cards have a little more text to them, but you can't do all those with Damnation. You can hit a Ral, but it's more expensive. So be realistic about bringing in a sweeper effect. I know people that bring in Stern Scolding in the matchup. I'm not a huge fan of it. I'll bring in 2 copies of Consign to Memory. Yes, you can consign to memory a Storm trigger on a Grape Shot. Typically, if your opponent has enough to like full on go off with a Grape Shot, then you're probably dead to them just like flashing back a Past in Flames and doing it again. So I wouldn't count that as an end all be all. But you can also tag a Ruby Medallion with it. You can hit stuff like a Ral flip trigger if your opponent is casting the last spell and having to go for it. You can hit the flip trigger off that. You can hit like a value Grape Shot on a Frog or something. Or I've seen blue builds of Ruby Storm bringing in Fluster Storm. You can hit a Storm trigger off Fluster Storm and be able to pay the 1 copy. It's got a bunch of just unique little uses. Not where I want 4 of them, but 1 or 2 is completely reasonable. So Consign to Memory, Grave Hate, EE. If you've got something like Fluster Storm in your own sideboard, it's definitely coming in here. Spell Pierces, extra spell snares, extra force negations, anything like that. From the Flash side, this matchup is a lot tougher for Flash than it is for Oculus or the Fair Frog decks. One, because you don't have access to the card Psychic Frog, which is like the best card advantage plus pressure option that you have. And if there's anything that's really good into Ruby Storm, it's card advantage plus pressure. So you have to be a little more careful about like flashing in a Wan Chi Tong as soon as you can, start getting the clock rolling. Or as soon as you get like some Wan Chi Tong value, maybe in response to a fetch plus a counter spell, or into turn to draw a card, get a clock going. Same kind of basic idea. Sheoldred's Edict's not very good. You might have to bring or leave in an extra Fatal Push, but Sheoldred's Edict's not great. Kaito, less good in these builds because you don't often have the ability to ninjutsu it as proactively, but I would still leave it in if you have the option. Sideboarding in, Graveyard Trespasser can be pretty decent to get some pressure going, as well as eat some extra cards in the yard. And then again, like the 2 copies of Consign to Memory if you have those in the sideboard, and then any Grave Hate. But basically the same board in, board outs as the Fair Frog deck. Oculus, this is a really, really good matchup for Oculus. Not gonna lie. You have more consistent early pressure than like the Fair Frog decks have, because you can do your thing completely uninterrupted. Your opponent's not messing with your graveyard and stopping unearths or thought scours or anything like that. So as long as you keep a hand that's able to get some sort of threat on the board, it can usually snowball very, very aggressively. Same idea. Stern Scolding, Strategic Betrayal. If you have Strategic Betrayal, I'm leaving it in for Past in Flames. If you have Sheoldred's Edict or like Shoot the Sheriff or something like that, I'm boarding it out. But you can board out some number Stern Scolding, some number of Fatal Push, board in. In this case, I've got like extra Force Negation in the board, Surgical Extractions, those things are coming in. Not really bringing in Kaito in the Oculus list, because you're more interested in getting an Oculus itself or a Frog on the battlefield and letting those snowball. Not so interested in Kaito because you don't really have the quantity of interactive pieces that some of the other builds have. But gameplay wise, the way I express it whenever I talk to a Storm player is, for the Fair Frog deck and the Oculus deck especially, your opponent has got 4 copies of Ruby Medallion and 4 copies of Ral Monsoon Mage. And from these 2 lists, you typically have 4 counter spells in each, 2 or 3 spell snare in each, 2 or 3 force negation in each, 3 or 4 Thoughtseize in each. You have got significantly more than 8 pieces of interaction for those 8 cards, and those 8 cards are basically the only thing you care about. Do not... I'm going to get close to the microphone so you know that I'm looking at you. Do not start blowing off your counter spells needlessly on like Rin's Resolves and Firebrain schemes and whatnot, Reckless Impulses, if you don't need to. Those cards aren't killing you. The mana reduction on Ruby Medallion or Ral will lead to you dying. It's possible that your opponent can go off with just like hard cast rituals and Past in Flames, but it is extraordinarily difficult for this deck. They don't have like the chain effects that Gift Storm used to have, where it was a lot easier for Gift Storm to go off naturally without a reducer. Artist Talent, gotta remember that one too. Artist Talent is in that same realm with Ral and Ruby Medallion. It's a lot tougher for these current Storm builds to go off without a reducer. So that's where like all of your focus needs to be if you have the choice. Now, if you've got an Oculus down and your opponent's got one card in hand and you've got 3 counter spells, yeah, fire it off on the Rin's Resolve if they put it on the stack. But use some critical thinking here. If the card's not killing you, save your counters for the cards that are killing you. Post board against Storm. From the Storm side, you've got kind of 2 builds. There's Is It Ruby Storm and Boros Ruby Storm. Sometimes you'll see some amalgamations, but the cards that you care about, Prismatic Ending and Orm's Chant out of the Boros options. Orm's Chant especially can be very annoying because it forces you to use interaction on the chant, or you just F6 through the turn. So if your opponent goes like Orm's Chant, you counter it, they don't go off next turn, second Orm's Chant. It can really put a lot of pressure on saving those counter spells. So that, again, that's why I really emphasize don't just throw your counter spells or whatever. Save them. Try to get a card advantage down, engine down early so that you don't have to tap out anymore. A lot of times these games come down to finding a spot that you have to go, not necessarily shields down, but shields slightly partway lowered. So for example, a frog, hold up force and negation and hope that your opponent has Ruby Medallion instead of Ral, or Unearth and Oculus with counterspell up or force, but you can't have both, and you just kind of have to hope that your opponent doesn't have the ability to kill you on that one turn. But you have cards like Thoughtseize to kind of set it up, Spell Snare to allow you to have an extra mana available for an interactive piece. So for like turn 3 frog plus snare, forced blue card, something like that. So you have a really good ability to set up that turn that you have to go kind of shields partially down, but you want it to be a one-time deal. You want it to go shields down one time and then never again, and use your card advantage to find you some more pieces of interaction. On the Is It side, that I said shows up occasionally, like Flusterstorm, bounce effects, Into the Flood Maw, something like that. Maybe Spell Pierce, Spell Snare out of them. I'm typically a lot happier to see that build than I am to see the Boros build, just because Orm's Chant is a card that you have to fight over or you lose. A lot of times Flusterstorm is not a card that you have to fight over. You can just let that happen and still be able to hold up your interaction. So it's a little bit better. And then I mentioned that wishing for Empty the Warrens is something to keep an eye out for. Stormscale Scion kind of on the same realm. And remember that if your opponent wishes, they don't have to announce what they're getting. They don't have to cast that card right that second. They just have access to something out of their sideboard at some point. So don't try to plan interacting or not interacting with Wish around what could my opponent do with this open mana right this second that makes the best use of Wish. Think about more of what could this lead to by the end of the turn if this Wish resolves. And usually you'll find yourself wanting to counter it instead of letting it resolve. All right, on to match number 4. For number 4, Goldfish has kind of got like Mono Green Tron and Eldrazi Tron all grouped together. So I'm gonna try to use as much much disparity as I can to separate the two when necessary, but for the most part, they all kind of fall into Urza Tron variants, Urza Tron land variants. So a lot of the sideboarding is really overlap, but there are a couple differences that I'll point out when they become relevant. From the frog side, things that are coming out: Fatal Push, Fatal Push, Fatal Push, Fatal Push, unless your opponent is on like a 4 Glaring Flesh Raker dedicated combo Flesh Raker build or something like that. And then you might want to leave in a couple copies of Fatal Push, but I typically board out Push and leave in Shieldred's Edict, because Edict has the chance to trade up with like a Sire of Seven Deaths or Devour Destiny, Ugin, Karn, something like that, where Fatal Push doesn't. So I try to get all the Fatal Pushes out, try to leave the Shieldred's Edicts in. Subtlety depends on the number of cast triggers. So if my opponent's on more Sire of Seven Deaths, Thought Knot Seers, Glaring Flesh Rakers, I'm more likely leaving Subtlety in. If they're on more Sowing Mycospawn, Chrysalis, whatever the stupid thing's name is, cards like that, Emrakul the Promised End, then I'm less likely to leave as many subtleties in. I just want to be able to subtlety when it's effectively a time walk, and not subtlety when my opponent's still going to get something out of it. Orcish Bowmaster can get trimmed a decent bit. If you're on a build that's heavy on Kaito, like 2 Kaito in the main or something, I'm more likely to leave Bowmasters in, because being able to chain a Bowmasters into Kaito is a good way to steal games with like the pressure and finding more consigned to memories post board, especially. Spell Snare is one that's a bit controversial. I leave Spell Snare in if my game plan post board heavily relies on Harbinger of the Seas. If I don't have Harbinger or I'm low on Harbinger, I'll take Spell Snares out. But being able to counter talismans and mind stones and stuff like that is extremely important when your game plan is keeping your opponent off of double colorless mana. Now, that's a really big point by itself that I need people to understand. And I could give like an entire lecture on Harbinger of the Seas as a lockout piece, because I feel like this is one of the most underutilized cards that Dimir has access to, is Harbinger of the Seas. And I think I see people mess up how to take advantage of Harbinger a lot, and that leads to them viewing it as like not effective or not good or something similar to that. And I want to try to set the record straight as much as possible. Harbinger of the Seas is not a 100% lockout piece. It's not going to stop your opponent from entirely like playing Magic. The goal of Harbinger of the Seas is to stop your opponent from casting double colorless spells. So Devourer of Destiny, Kozilek's Command, cards that are going to exile your threats as well as give your opponent an advantage, and have cast triggers or things that like you have to interact with, you have to respect or lose to. If you take those 8 cards out of the deck, out of the equation, and you're able to start focusing your consigned memories on like Ugins that are coming down 3-4 turns later than scheduled, or focusing your consigns on like Glaring Flesh Rakers if your opponent does have a waste, it makes it so that your interaction is able to line up a lot more effectively compared to needing to stop cast triggers off Devourers, end of turn Kozilek's commands, cast triggers off Ugins, cast triggers off like Emrakul the Promised End, but you only have 4 consigned. So Harbinger just takes like 8 of those out of the equation, lets you narrow down the scope of what you have to pay attention to. That's why it's so good. So 4 consigns definitely coming in. Harbinger's definitely coming in. If you've got like an extra Kaito, a lot of times I will bring it in just because they can't Kozilek's command it, they can't dismember it, It's a little bit better at being a sticky threat that lets you find more like consigned memories and stuff. And then boarding out fatal pushes, boarding out some number of like cling to dust if you got those, maybe trimming on bowmasters, and just trying to be a proactive value deck, trying to get on the board quickly, find more counter magic, and be selective about what your counter magic is doing. Don't go wasting consigned memories on Karn the Great Creator if you can force pitch like an extra frog instead. Save your consigns for the cast triggers. I think this is personally, I think it's a slightly positive matchup for Dimir. I've heard people say otherwise. I think percentage-wise, I've been very favorable against Tron over the last couple of years, but I also think that, not to toot my own horn, I do a pretty good job of setting up Harbingers. So if you ever want to hear more about that, you're welcome to join the Discord and ask questions, and I'm more than happy to break through all my thought processes with Harbinger. From the Flash variants, Eldrazi is a little bit rougher. You have Field of Ruin to help keep them off of like Tron lands, or to maybe strip mine and Ugin's Labyrinth and like strand something in exile, but not having the pressure is a really big deal. Not being able to get a frog down, get card advantage going while you clock your opponent is very sorely missing from the Grixis build. And I do want to mention the sideboarding pretty heavily here for two reasons. One, the Flash build typically doesn't run Harbinger of the Seas, so Field of Ruin is kind of like your only way of interacting with a lot of their mana, except there's a flex option. And you'll see on the screen right now, I've got 3 copies of Spreading Seas. This is my personal opinion. I know players like Aspiring Spike, who really put this Flash deck on the map. Players like Nahuel, who's done so well in some of the challenges, really big on Break the Ice. I've had a lot of issues casting Break the Ice on curve with 4 Island, 4 Field of Ruin, and turn like 4 Break the Ice is just way too slow. So I've been on Spreading Seas. I've liked it in previous builds of Dimir a lot because, 1, the redraw is relevant. 2, just like Harbinger, you're not so interested in cutting your opponent off of being able to cast things entirely as much as you are cutting them off of like double colorless. So being able to hit Ugin's Labyrinth, Eldrazi Temple, something like that early to really slow down your opponent's progression. And 3, it pitches to Force Negation and Subtlety, which can be extremely relevant. Or being able to like take out your opponent's waste if you are on some number of Harbinger. I think that Spreading Seas is a little more effective against Eldrazi, but not as great against like Urza's Saga. So for Flash, whatever your land hate of choice is, Break the Ice, Spreading Seas. I seen mention of like the Cleansing Wildfire type effects. Some people want to try that out. Whatever your option is, I think those cards are pretty decent to have, or pretty good to bring in post board. Any consigned memories are definitely coming in. Same board outs, like Fatal Push is coming out. Spell Snare is a lot worse out of the Flash deck against Eldrazi than the other builds because of Harbinger. So being able to trim Spell Snare instead of Fatal Push, like leave some extra interaction in for Flesh Raker or Thought Knot, could be relevant. But the same plan kind of holds true, is use your counter spells on things that don't have cast triggers, use your consigns on things that do. A lot of times, like Devourer of Destiny, cards like that are going to be fairly dead in your opponent's hand because you're not going to have a threat out. So being able to like Wan Chi Tong for a bunch, untap, attack in with your Wan Chi Tong, pass back, your opponent devours, and you just, like, you might have a consign, but just ignoring that Devourer trigger, Shieldred's edicting their Devourer, and then playing like another Wan Chi Tong can be a much better path to victory than trying to consign that Devourer trigger right there. So just be a little more cognizant of like what's actually impacting the game versus what is just something on the stack that you don't have to worry about that much. And then Oculus, I think, is a lot more favored into the Eldrazi variants because one, you have a very quick clock if you're able to mulligan effectively to a quick Oculus or to a Harbinger hand, or just oops over into a Harbinger with a Thought Scour or Surveil. You're able to cheese out a lot more games, getting down a bigger threat quicker, and being able to hold up interaction is a lot more effective. Same idea, Fatal Push, pretty bad. Keeping in Spell Snare, boarding out, in this case, like Stern Scolding, boarding in Consigned Memories, Force Negation, Harbingers. Not so worried about Kaito in this build because you're really geared about getting Oculus down or getting Harbinger down. It's also really important with Oculus to know that manifesting Harbinger does not use the stack. So you can pass to your opponent's upkeep, resolve your Oculus trigger. Let's say you flip over a face down Harbinger, or you manifest a Harbinger. You can pay and flip it up while still on their upkeep before you pass to their main phase. And they can't respond with like floating a bunch of colorless mana or anything like that. So it's a good line to have in your back pocket. But you do have to have priority. So the way that you want to set this up, don't say something. Don't say something until you have to. So for example, if you're upkeep, you resolve your Oculus manifest, put a Harbinger face down, and your opponent goes to draw their card, stop them and say, before you draw, I'm flipping up this Harbinger because you have priority. Technically, your opponent has priority, but as soon as they go to draw their card, they're passing priority. The way the manifest works is on their upkeep, they have priority on the manifest trigger. They pass priority, you get priority, you pass priority, the manifest resolves, you get a Harbinger face down. Now there's an empty stack, back to them having priority on their upkeep still. It doesn't pass along to their draw step until both players pass priority on an empty stack. So if they go to draw, indicating they're shortcutting passing priority on their turn, at that point you would say, I'm going to flip up this Harbinger. Before we go to your draw step, I'm going to pay 3, flip it up. You can get into a sketchy situation if you do something like, say, I have effects before we go to your draw step, because if your opponent hasn't indicated that they want to pass priority, it's still their priority on their upkeep, and they might want to float a bunch of mana and like Kozilek's Command your face down or something like that. So you have to be within the rules of the game without angle shooting, but know when you have the opportunity to make actions without making it so that it's obvious there's something that you're wanting to do or specific action you're wanting to take. If you want more details on that, again, Discord, best way to reach me, and I will be more than happy to explain the breakdown there. But that's all I got for the Eldrazi matchup. Let's move on to the next one. Matchup number 5 is the absolute bane of my entire modern existence. And if you've watched any of my live streams, you know exactly why. It's Affinity. I think that the Affinity matchup is like 90-10 in Affinity's favor. It is such a ridiculously bad matchup. We'll kind of get into some tips and tricks I've found to steal games. Whether or not they steal matches is a completely different argument, but we'll see what we can do. Against Affinity for most of the fair frog decks. Kaito, really, really bad. Tamiyo, really, really bad. Just no way of getting through blockers reliably to set up Kaito. Tamiyo, really awkward into like drone tokens. If you can flip, you can like stop drones from attacking you, but you can't really attack into drones effectively to get Tamiyo flipped. Cling to Dust, pretty bad. It gets a little bit better if they're heavy on Emery, but a lot of lists are on like 2, so there's a reasonable chance they won't see it. Fatal Push, necessary, but hate it. Spell Snare, even though they have 4 weapons manufacturing, cutting all the spell snares. You still have Counterspell, Force Negation, Thought Seize, kind of like a lot of the other matchups, but you don't want to have spell snares into like a bunch of zeros and Emery and a Kappa Cannoneer or whatever. So cutting all the spell snares. Murktide, if you have Murktide, it's one that you can cut pretty easy between Aether's Spellbomb, bouncing it after you take out your own graveyard, or something like Soul Guide Lantern exiling the graveyard, drone token standing in the way. It can be a lot of cost to get Murktide on the battlefield for very low return. Sideboarding to bring in, I usually look at like Engineered Explosives or any of your permanent based removal. So Engineered Explosives, Pest Control if you're splashing white. We see decks like the Flash deck splashing red for Meltdown pretty constantly. All of those are definitely coming in. Mystical Dispute is coming in because you want to be able to fight over Kappa Cannoneer or Emery or Pinnacle Emissary or Krang, whatever the case may be. And then if you have any all like big sweepers, so Toxic Deluge is coming in, even though it's not great because it can kill Kappa Cannoneer. Damnation is coming in if you have like Supreme Verdict or something like that. Wrath Disguise. I have not found a functional mana base to splash for double white Wrath Disguise yet, but that's definitely on the agenda of things I would like to find a way to do, but I have not yet. So if you have suggestions there, I'm definitely all ears. So yeah, Wrath Disguise, Mystical Dispute, EE, Pest Control, Meltdown, and then Consign to Memory. I usually bring in 2 Consign. The reason being, it's good for stopping like Chapter 2 on Urza's Saga, so they can't make constructs. Sometimes you want to counter Chapter 3 if your opponent's low on mana and you think that they're going to get a Mox Opal. It can be okay on the play for fighting over like a turn 1 Mox Opal, just to try to slow things down a little bit. Or if you're on Shoot the Sheriff, you can target a Kappa Cannoneer and then consign to memory the ward trigger. But a lot of times I'm not on Shoot the Sheriff. I'm more on like Shieldred's Edict or Strategic Betrayal, which Edict is definitely a lot better than Betrayal, except a lot of the Affinity decks are running some number of Midnights now, so you have to be careful of that. Weapons manufacturing is a bit of a nightmare because Engineered Explosives, Pest Control, Meltdown all blow up the munitions tokens. So if you're not able to keep manufacturing off the board and your opponent is able to go off with a bunch of 0 drops afterwards, you run the risk of just doming yourself for like 8 or 10 damage off of your sweeper effect, which a lot of times is worth it to clear the board. But you do have to have a pretty good follow-up or it just might not matter. From their side, they're definitely bringing in like Blood Moons and Mystical Disputes. So being able to get some number of basics to play around Blood Moon if the opportunity arises. Mystical Dispute is not really much different than Metallic Rebuke. Like, it's always going to be on your radar. So if you can play around it, go for it. A lot of times the games are moving so quickly and so many actions so early, you don't really have a chance to play around it. So if you can't, you can't. But if you can, might as well try to. Your big Kryptonite cards out of the matchups for the fair Frog decks. Aether's Spellbomb is an absolute nightmare. Being able to bounce a frog, or especially like with Emery, replay Spellbomb, bounce frogs again, bounce Quantum Riddlers, Murktide, anything like that. Emery is a huge problem. So making sure you have interaction for Emery on turn 1. So like on the draw, fetch Fatal Push, on the play, Mystical Dispute. The Pinnacle Emissary starts. The start itself, if you're able to have a Pest Control or a Meltdown or something like that in your opening hand, the Pinnacle Emissary drones usually aren't a big issue as long as you can answer the follow-up. What follow-up it is usually the bigger question. So for example, if your opponent plays a Kappa Cannoneer, you have Thoughtseize, Mystical Dispute, Subtlety can kind of slow it down. Counterspell to help fight over Kappa Cannoneer. But if your opponent plays an Urza's Saga as the follow-up, that can be a lot more problematic if they're able to drop down a bunch of drones and just make some big constructs. So then you really need the pest control or meltdown route. For the flash builds, I haven't played as much flash, and I've had people say that the flash build is better into Affinity, which to an extent I believe, because Field of Ruin giving you 4 main deck answers to 4 Urza Sagas is a big deal. Being able to hold up your mana and kind of interact more consistently on your opponent's turn is really nice, into Kappa Cannoneers and Emrys on the stack, stuff like that. And being able to play cards like Wan Chi Tong that you don't really care if your opponent Aether Spell Bombs, like you get value off of it. You're not a graveyard dependent deck, so Tormod's Crypt doesn't matter too much. Get access to Fire Magic to help out with drones, Meltdown to help out with all the other artifacts. This is a matchup where Break the Ice is a lot better than Spreading Seas, because actually blowing up Urza's Saga is better than just leaving it around as a mana source. But both cards are pretty effective. Like Spreading Seas on chapter 1 is really good because you don't really care about them having extra mana unless they have a sink into Stupor. They're not going to be able to get the Spreading Seas off the battlefield. But that 1 extra mana usually doesn't matter as long as you're stopping them from like searching up and making constructs. And then same idea, like Mystical Disputes, Consigned Memories. From the Oculus side, things get a lot tougher because usually the Affinity deck's like a 3 or 4 main deck Tormod's Crypt deck. So Tormod's Crypt kind of shutting off Unearth means post board you're boarding out multiple Oculus, multiple Unearth, trying to play this like fair-ish mid-range game that you're really just not designed to play. So being a frog deck, Graveyard Trespasser, unfortunately, has got to stay in just because you have to have some sort of pressure. Again, Engineered Explosives coming in, Pest Control if you're on white. I have played some Esper Oculus with Clarion Conqueror in the board. That's not bad here. I've also played some fair lists with Stony Silence in the board. So that's another card that if you have access to, I would definitely be bringing in, but not one that I think too many Dimir players are splashing for, just because it's not really worth it, honestly, boarding in like 11 cards to bring a matchup from realistically 2080 to like 3070. So for the most part, Affinity, unless you have some really spicy techie sideboard plan, is just going to be an awful matchup, and there's not a ton you can do about it. But if you do find that spicy tech, I am all ears because I'm always looking for ideas. I think that's all I got for that one. Sideboarding, like sideboard plan wise, on the play, you really need a hand that interacts with Pinnacle Emissary or Emry. So fetch, Fatal Push, or Mystical Dispute on turn 1, or Thoughtseize, something along those lines. And then I don't think this is a matchup that you can have any chance in without seeing one of those non-land permanent sweepers. So Engineered Explosives, Pest Control, Meltdown. I think you have to see at least one of those to have a reasonable chance. And all you're trying to do is stop the early explosion to give you time to set up interaction for the Kappa Cannoneer, and then follow up with blow away all of the non-land permanents so your opponent can't just untap and follow with another Kappa Cannoneer. But that's all I got for Affinity. Let's move on to matchup number 6. Matchup number 6 just survived yet another ban announcement simply by being difficult to play. It's Amulet Titan. I feel like Amulet Titan is a deck that falls so in and out of favor. People try to pick it up, run it at a big event, doesn't do well for them, does well for somebody who's got thousands of hours logged on Amulet Titan, but doesn't do well for them. They drop it, move on to like Boros Energy, something that's a little more plug and play. So I'm going to approach this with the expectation that your Titan opponent is a very, very good Titan player and not just somebody that picked it up for the weekend, because it's really difficult to express, but the difference in playing between somebody who's seasoned on Titan and somebody who kind of knows their basic lines is night and day different. And for the most part, like, any of the frog decks are going to have a pretty good time into somebody who's not sure about their lines. Subtlety, Counterspell, Psychic Frog just kind of all do a lot of really good work. But it's those top tier Amulet players that really are going to give you trouble that you got to keep an eye out for. So just in general, sideboarding against Amulet Titan. Fatal Push can get trimmed pretty heavily. I usually leave like 1 or 2 in. Sometimes you just want to clear out an Arboreal Grazer to get an attack through. Sometimes you want to take out Saga Construct or a 6, a Tireless Tracker, an Ice Till Explorer, whatever. So it's nice to have like a piece of interaction or two. So like leaving a Fatal Push, leaving in 2 Shieldred's Edicts, kind of calling it a day there. The rest of the sideboarding, Spell Snare comes out pretty aggressively. Like, even if they're on Malevolent Rumble or Explore, Spell Snare I just don't think is worth the spot. Kind of same thing with Affinity. You don't want to be stuck staring down a bunch of like Green Sun Zeniths and Summoners packs and Amulets, Spelunking, Scapeshift, whatever, and you've got Spell Snare in hand. Force Negation, I'm a little higher on. I usually keep in all the forces because they can hit all the stuff that I just mentioned, as well as hit the Malevolent Rumble or the Explore, whatever that Spell Snare could hit. The Tamios, kind of bad. Orcish Bowmaster, kind of bad. Kaito, kind of mid. Usually Amulet has got a lot more explosive turns than like an Eldrazi deck. So identifying whether or not your opponent can go off is kind of the difference between whether or not you should get a threat down. And after like turn 3, they're a threat to go off pretty much every turn. So 3-mana threats are a little bit awkward. Cling to Dust, not great, but it has, the first Cling to Dust isn't bad because you can interact with like a Shifting Woodlands target, exiling a Primeval Titan or something in the yard that you wouldn't be able to counterspell. Or exile a Aftermath Analyst from the yard, something like that. So it's not dead, it can help fight combo, but typically with Dimir, you're not that afraid of them comboing off because your entire game plan is like stopping a Titan from resolving in the first place. Cards that I'm bringing in, Consign to Memory, typically bring in all 4 copies. You can counter Amulet on the stack, you can counter Saga Search Trigger for an Amulet, you can counter Primeval Titan ETB, Spelunking ETB. There's games that you can time walk your opponent by hitting an Amulet untap trigger on like a bounce land to stop them from playing something afterwards. So for example, your opponent goes turn 1, land Amulet, turn 2, bounce land, you hit the untap trigger on the Amulet, and all they can do is pick up a land, go next turn. So situations like that are really good for Consign. You can hit Vexing Baubles on the stack, which is less exciting, but comes up from time to time. Engineered Explosives, I usually bring in 1 copy to hit Amulet, to hit Urza Saga Constructs, but mostly just take out Amulets so that you're hopefully not in a spot where your opponent can actually combo off on you. Harbinger of the Seas is best card in the matchup by a mile. You do have to be careful of like Dismember, but if you can get down a Harbinger in a spot where your opponent doesn't have access to double green, then you can cut down to Green Suns being the only card you care about. And if you're able to cut out green completely, then Dismember becomes the only card you care about outside of like Otawara. So you do have to be a little bit careful to not let your, or not just give your opponent a free opportunity to like transmute a Teleria West for an Otawara, but it doesn't come up that often. Everything else on the board, pretty mid. So like Consigns, Harbingers, I usually don't give too much credit to the combo element, because more often than not, your Amulet opponent's not going to have an opportunity to combo off through all of your interaction. but you do at least need to be aware of like the lines available that can allow your opponent to combo off. So keeping track of if they can scape shift for lethal right now, keeping track of like, is there a Lotus Field already in their graveyard? Things like that can make a big deal. From the flash side, it's kind of like against Jeskai Blink. There's not a ton to board out here. Some fatal pushes, pretty good to board out. I could board out a Kaito in this build, maybe Bowmasters, and bring in like your Spreading Seas or Break the Ice to fight over Urza Saga, Consign to Memory for the same reason, stop a bunch of these ETB triggers. I don't normally believe I would bring in Meltdown. The flash deck is a little bit better at not caring about Amulet because you're on like 4 counterspell, 4 subtlety, so you can a lot more easily interact with a Titan on this stack, even if it's not necessarily counterspell. Oculus, the board outs, usually it's just swapping out like Graveyard Trespasser, bringing in Harbinger of the Seas, and then anything like Surgical Extraction, Consign to Memory, your combo hate pieces come in over some amount of fatal pushes, spell snares. Usually Amulet's not on endurance anymore, so you're not really afraid of your opponent interacting with Unearth Oculus. Even if they have like a Bajuka Bog, they typically can't get it instant speed. So if you set up your Unearth Oculus by like Frog, discard Unearth, or end of turn Surveil or Thought Scour, a threat to the bin, untap Unearth, there's really like no way for them to effectively interact with that. Again, it kind of comes down to just Dismember being the thing to keep an eye out for if you keep a hand that goes all in on a threat and not so much interaction. But the important part about post-board games against Amulet, game 1, there's a reasonable chance that your hand's not going to line up effectively. Like you might see too many fatal pushes, not enough counter spells, stuff like that. Games 2 and 3, it's really important to recognize like what pivotal turns look like and what you're okay losing to. So for example, if my opponent has got turn 1 land Amulet, then I want to keep an eye out for like turn 2 Spelunking, obviously, or turn 2 like land Grazer, Spelunking, another land to set up for turn 3 Titan. And if my hand only has like 1 piece of interaction, I probably let them have the ramp spells so I can fight over the Titan. If I have multiple pieces of interaction, I might fight over or pick a piece of interaction to fight over, like Arboreal Grazer, so that they can't have an explosive turn off of a future Spelunking, because they got to spend more mana for Spelunking. But like finding an opportunity to get a threat down and then untap counterspell after counterspell. The Amulet builds, let's see, thumb through real quick. Usually 2 to 3 copies of Dismember. That's the biggest nightmare card to deal with. 6 Tireless Trackers. Some of them are now on Trinisphere, which is fine. A lot of times, if your Amulet opponent's bringing in Trinisphere against you, more often than not, you can just get to 3 mana and like do all of your normal plays. Force Negation's not great in the matchup, so you don't really need to force something and counterspell, or you can just hard cast Force into like a Green Suns for 7, and you only need 3 mana to do that. So a lot of games that start off with your opponent going like land Amulet, bounce land Trinisphere, you can actually afford to just ignore the Trinisphere, especially if you're on the play and you're going to be untapping with your 3rd land anyway. So much like the Tron matchup, try to keep an eye on like what actually matters, what's actually killing you, versus what is just something being put on the stack that is kind of like bells and whistles, look over here style, and not actually like putting you at 0 style. So that's Amulet. Let's get on to the next one. Number 7 is Esper Goryo's Vengeance. Another matchup that's like really fallen out of favor recently. It still shows up from time to time in challenge top 8s and whatnot, but doesn't really have like the paper presence that it's had previously. Just like the Blink matchups, like Esper Blink and Jeskai Blink, it's a really, really good Kaito matchup if you're able to get one of those down. Though they do have 4 colors in their mana base and Prismatic Ending, so they can technically Prismatic Ending a Kaito if you're not careful. But that is a 4-mana sorcery speed play into like the Force Negation counterspell deck. The big keys for Goryos, if you can keep Frog from resolving. So, well, let's get into the sideboarding first. Things that I'm boarding out against Goryos. I usually trim like a copy or 2 of Fatal Push. They do have Frog. If they're on Emperor of Bones, I might leave all the Fatal Pushes in, but typically trimming a couple copies. I'll trim like a copy of Force of Negation. It's a little bit awkward into Goryos because they can cast it on your end step where you don't get it discounted, though it's still really good into Prismatic Ending and Teferi and stuff like that. Everything else in the Fair Murktide deck, or the Fair Frog deck, like this mid-range build outside of Murktide itself, I'm usually pretty happy to keep in. Things that I'm looking to board in: Kaito, Mystical Disputes, Ghost Vacuum, or like any other sort of Grave Hate. Most of the time your Goryo's opponent's going to be going heavy on the mid-range plan post-board, so they're going to be either trimming on combo or cutting pretty heavily on it to try to go more into like the Quantum Riddler Ephemerate loop or Quantum Riddler Consign, something like that, just to keep a Riddler around. So you really don't want to cut on like Shieldred's Edicts, counter spells, things that interact with that. But if you're able to find a Ghost Vacuum, a Cling to Dust, you can pretty well stop the entire Goryo's game plan with just like one piece of interaction. Their sideboard plan, really similar to ours, like bringing in Mystical Disputes, Teferi Time Reveler, stuff like that, where we're bringing in Mystical Disputes and like Kaito. Thankfully, Kaito kind of beats up on Teferi 1v1. So if you're able to aggressively get down a Kaito, and that's always like the key to this, is try to aggressively get down Kaito if you can. Obviously, it needs to be in a spot where you've got some sort of barrier up. So going for like a Kaito on turn 3 when your opponent's tapped out, or going for Kaito when your opponent can end of turn go for a draw spell, but you've got Force Negation on their turn for a Goryo's Vengeance, something like that. Or after a Thoughtseize where you've kind of cleared the way. But getting down Kaito is a lot of times like lights out into a lot of these builds. In the Flash deck, a little bit worse than the traditional Frog Tide decks, because like, again, it's another matchup where having Frog and Kaito and like these card advantage clocks is a big deal, where Grixis or where any of the Flash variants are more reliant on having more counter magic than your opponent has threats to present, and that can be awkward when they have access to instant speed effects like Flash in Solitude into turn, or into turn Faithful Mending Goryo, something like that. So you'd have to be a little more wary. Grave Hate is a lot more important for the Flash deck. Graveyard Trespasser is really, really good. Mystical Dispute we already talked about. Consign to Memory is also a little bit better out of the Flash deck, because you can consign like an Atraxa ETB and Shieldred's Edict, where a lot of the other builds aren't running as many edicts, so it's not as consistent of a line to set up. But the Oculus deck, it's kind of like Jeskai Blink, where a Quantum Riddler on board can stand in front of an Oculus really, really well. So you got to be careful of that. Like having an answer to Quantum Riddler is a lot more important. So your Mystical Disputes are more important. You might even look at Surgicaling Quantum Riddler to stop the fair game plan. Kaito, again, excellent bring in. Harbinger of the Seas, like Jeskai, you can have games where Harbinger is a pseudo lockout if your opponent's really showing that they're valuing getting Surveils early. It's never going to be like guaranteed, but it's a little bit better in Oculus again, since you can oops into it. So I would almost always bring in at least one Harbinger just for the accidental stumbled into Thought Scour Unearth, or like Thought Seize, Thought Scour Unearth, whatever the case may be. Which is an element that the Oculus build kind of brings to the table that the others don't. If you're on the white splash, Teferi Time Reveler is really, really good to have access to. And if you're on one of the fair builds, I've actually found that you can support Rest in Peace fairly well. All it really turns into is you can't jump the frog, but a lot of the matchups you're doing are bringing in Rest in Peace. You don't care about jumping the frog. Tamiyo can't rebuy something, but you can still make a clue every turn. And you've got to cut any like Murktide Regent's Post board. But stuff like Rest in Peace can be really good for just eliminating half of the deck's, half of Goryo's functionality and allowing you to focus entirely on the fair game plan, the Quantum Riddler, Teferi Time Reveler, Evoke, Consign, Solitude, stuff like that. But Teferi is absolutely lights out. Playing your own Quantum Riddlers is really good. Ghost Vacuum, already mentioned. Anything like Nihil Spellbomb, really good. Ashiok Dream Render, if you have access to that in your sideboard, is pretty good here. Just being able to kind of stall things out. That's it for Goryos. Is there any other cards I'm missing that I didn't include? Strategic Betrayal is good. Shoot the Sheriff is fine. Again, like, Shieldred's Edict is your best option into a lot of their threats, but there are other options you have access to that are pretty good. Stern Scolding is okay. Hits Frog Solitude. Emperor Bones if they're on that one. Yeah. Not too much to say about Goryos because most of that's already been covered in the Jeskai Blink section, so we'll just move on to the next one. Number 8 is Domain Zoo. Domain Zoo is actually really fun deck to play both with and against. Had a few local Zoo players that have got it in their back pocket. But anyway, a couple different builds of Zoo. I'm going to talk about the traditional build, which is like Flage, Scion, Kavu, Doorkeeper Thrall, Ragavan, that stuff. You might run into builds that are blue heavy with like Quantum Riddler, Psychic Frog. You might run into builds with, I've seen with an Archon, Persist sub theme. I've seen builds with Null Drifter, Consign in the main, but I'm just gonna assume those are like one-offs. You might see, probably not, but the traditional Zoo build is the one I'm gonna focus in on. Sideboarding out. I used to be really big on sideboarding out Thoughtseize against Zoo, but now that they've got no copies of Tribal Flames in the 75 and they're all in on like the Scion plan, I'd leave the Thoughtseizes in. Bowmaster is pretty weak. I'll like keep a couple on the play. Pretty likely to board them out aggressively on the draw. The only card they're good into is Ragavan, and if you're on the draw, you really need to have like a Fatal Push, or a Frog or something to stand in the way. Bowmaster doesn't really do too much, because if they get that first attack in, now you have to start worrying about like Doorkeeper Thrall shutting down your Bowmaster ETB. And then it just doesn't stand in the way of like any other threat in their deck. So Bowmaster is pretty weak. Kaito, especially on the draw, is a little bit weaker. Tamiyo can be a little bit weaker, especially into like Flage. A lot of times against Flage decks, outside of the value decks, like the Blink ones, if Flage kills a creature with the front half, I'm probably boarding that creature out into the Flage matchup. Force Negation can get trimmed. Another one of these matchups where like Leyline Binding can be cast on your own instep, where you don't get a Force Negation reduction, and they're not as likely to cast it on their own turn, so it's a little bit weaker. So Force Negation can get trimmed. Spell Snare, I'll usually trim pretty aggressively. It hits Kavu, it hits Doorkeeper Thrall, but with no Tribal Flames, and you already have like Fatal Pushes to help with Kavu and Thrall, counter spells. I don't want as many answers to things that aren't Scions. So trimming spell snares, trimming force negation, cutting Tameo, trimming bowmasters, bringing in all 4 copies of Consign to Memory, because especially on the draw, being able to answer a Scion of Draco on turn 2 is huge. Also hits like the ETB off Leyline Binding, and those are kind of the 2 best cards they have access to in the matchup. So having 4 cards, 4 cards to come in that kind of stop those 2 things is a big deal. Harbinger of the Seas is a little bit dicey. Usually I'll bring in like a Harbinger on the play, maybe 2 going into game 2, kind of see how my opponent respects it. And then if they respect it a lot, I'll drop down to like 1 on the play game 3 or none on the draw game 3. But it's really a play it by ear card. Like if your opponent is if your opponent's got a Leyline of the Guild Pact and they're aggressively fetching up like Surveil lands, Harbinger gets exponentially better. But if they got a Leyline of the Guild Pact and they're just sitting on their fetches and playing out spells, then Harbinger gets a lot worse. So you kind of have to keep an eye on what they're doing to dictate whether Harbinger's staying in. The last cards are Toxic Deluge. I always bring in Deluge against Zoo because you want an out. You want all of your outs to resolve Scion of Draco, even if they don't look great. Just having them as a potential answer. And I've absolutely had games where my opponents have gone like turn 2 Scion, turn 3 Scion. I had Deluge for 4 and got to take both of them out through a ley line, and it felt amazing. It's not ideal, but you got to do what you got to do. Mystical Dispute is the other one that it depends on the build. If my opponent's bringing in, like if it's open deck list and my opponent's bringing in 3 Mystical Disputes and like Teferis and has Quantum Riddler or something, then I'm bringing in Dispute. If it's closed deck list, they got to show me a lot of blue stuff before I bring in Dispute. So another kind of play it by ear choice. On their side, they don't really have a ton to board in. Mystical Disputes of their own. Teferi, if they got that. Wrath the Skies, maybe, but probably not. Nihil Spellbomb, again, maybe, but probably not. It's pretty much face up kind of on both sides. Like your main deck is kind of what you're fighting with for the most part, all 3 games. From the Flash build, the Graveyard Trespassers are definitely coming in because they're great into any of the Flage matchups. And if you're able to flip it into a 4/4, turn it to Night, you can dodge Lightning Bolt, you can dodge Flage ETB, which are both extremely relevant. So having a threat that survives 8 pieces of their removal is a big deal and forces the ward trigger. The Consign to Memory, as I already mentioned, are coming in. Mystical Dispute, like I said, depends on how they're respecting it. Same thing with Spreading Seas. Like, Spreading Seas can be really good into non-leyline hands if your opponent is getting basics and not getting like Domain online. It can also be kind of dead if your opponent just sees like 4 lands. So you got to play it by ear, see how they're fetching, see if it actually does anything worth disrupting. The sideboard's out in the Flash deck. Spell Snare, again, kind of weak. Force Negation, again, kind of weak. Because a lot of your threats in Flash, you don't really care if your opponent leyline bindings. So you're not so worried about fighting over binding at any point. So Force Negation just kind of like becomes completely useless. Counter spells and consigns to help with Scions. You've got you're keeping your Bowmasters in the Flash deck to help with Ragavan, or keeping most of them in. Maybe board out Kaito. The entire matchup for both the Flash build and the Frog build just kind of revolve around not letting Scion stick around. It's a really tough threat to deal with when it's on the board, so answering it on the stack is pretty high priority. And then not letting them get to a point where they can just keep escaping Flage. Out of the Oculus build against Zoo, Harbinger is a much higher priority because, again, you have those games where you can oops into it. So your opponent might just play a 2-drop on 2 and you Thought Scour into a Harbinger, unearth it, and they can just never put anything else on the stack. But again, if your opponent is like really respecting Harbinger, you're probably not bringing all of them in post board. You might keep like 1 in, but I would never cut all of them unless you're on the draw and your opponent is like super respecting it, like getting basic mountain first, never tapping off of it, something like that. If they do that game 2, then I'd board them all out game 3. The consigns again coming in, almost the same as what matchup was it earlier? Almost the same as Storm. They're not really interacting with your graveyard. Like Nihil Spellbomb is a slightly bigger consideration for Oculus than it is for the other builds, but it's a face-up thing that you know about. So typically going into sideboarding with Oculus, I'll trim like 1 Oculus, 1 Unearth, 1 Thought Scour. Just go down a little bit on that package because you can still hard cast Oculus pretty well, which stands in the way of Scion of Draco and starts building up a board presence. It's a little bit tougher for them because they're not gaining where Quantum Riddler stands in front of abhorrent Oculus and draws you a bunch of cards. Scion of Draco standing in front of Oculus, it doesn't actually stand in front of Oculus because you can attack into it, but it's not drawing you cards, so you don't mind that stalemate nearly as much. Other than that, not too much else to say from the Oculus build. Just trimming a little bit of the Unearth package to play around like Kavu, exiling stuff from your yard, and Nihil Spellbomb or something like that. And trimming on, just like the other ones, Force Negation, Spell Snare, Stern Scolding here, and bringing in those consigns and potentially Harbinger. That's about it for Zoo. On to number 9. Sounds right. Number 9, I was really surprised to see is Neo Brand. I was shocked that Neo Brand is in the top 10 in terms of play percentage on MTG Goldfish, but it is what it is. Another matchup that I think is pretty favorable for like all the Dimir variants, having counter spells, force negations, thought seizes for Neoforms, or for Eldritch Evolutions, having subtlety to help out with Allosaurus Rider or hooting mandrills, whatever the case may be. Spell snares for Neoforms, Sink into Stupor, Shieldred's Edicts. Like, you have a whole bunch of stuff that's really good against them. The board ends are a little bit interesting, and this is again based off of my experience. If you have differing experience, I always encourage people to defer to their own experience as opposed to someone else. The 3 mystical disputes are the big like auto include, because you want to fight over stuff they're bringing in, like their own mystical disputes. I've seen some of these builds going into like a fair Ice Fang abhorrent Oculus build post board, and disputes great against all of that as well. So dispute in general, great. Harbinger of the Seas, one that I will probably get some flack for, but I bring in all of my Harbingers in this matchup because, one, a lot of the Neoform builds are only on like one single copy of some sort of forest, and if you're able to get a Harbinger down, you shut off like Eldritch Evolution completely. But if you're able to get one down before they get their forest, which again, this is a matchup kind of like Jeskai Blink, where if both players know that the matchup's going to be going long and they're getting Surveils, they're getting Hedge Mazes early, trying to set up these draws, then dropping down a Harbinger can just be like GG's because your opponent has no access to green mana anymore. And without green mana, they can't Neoform, they can't Eldritch Evolution, they can't like Veil of Summer or anything. And the only thing you care about at that point is hard cast Allosaurus Rider, which you've got a pretty good way or number of ways to deal with, like just getting a bigger frog. But regardless, Harbinger of the Sea is really good. And then Consigned to Memory, I usually board in like 2 copies. Atraxa ETB is a big thing to be able to decide to consign to memory. But I've also had numerous games where my opponent has like gone for Summoner's Pact to go get an Allosaurus Rider, and then played out their Rider, got like an Atraxa or something off a Neoform, or gone for a Neoform, had to Pact of Negation my counterspell on the Neoform, get an Atraxa, draw some cards, and then go to their upkeep and go to consign, replicate to hit their Pact triggers. And I've consigned the replicate trigger on their consign, and they died being unable to pay for their own Pact. It's kind of funny against really fast starts. You can also have they have one Pact to pay for. They replicate consign to counter their Pact trigger. You counter their consigns, replicate trigger, and then force negation for the actual consign. It's come up more than I thought it would, and enough to be worth mentioning. So, 2 consigns, all 3 harbingers, all 3 mystical disputes, and then I'll bring in Kaito as well, because if you can get Frog, a disruptive or a pressure card advantage engine, that's the easiest way to get to victory in a lot of these unfair matchups. But you also have to recognize that you either play it out because you have to and you're going shields down, or you've thought seized and the coast is kind of clear, or you just accept that you're going to lose to some stuff. But if you get to untap, you're really, really far ahead. Board outs, the 4 fatal push are the easiest 4 board outs ever. I don't think they hit anything that's not endurance. If you know your opponent's on the Ice Fang Abhorrent Oculus sideboard plan, I would make them show me that before I respect it. So I wouldn't leave in fatal pushes expecting them to do that. I would make them show it to me game 2 and then decide how much I want to respect that going forward. Because again, you do still have spell snares and counter spells and Thoughtseize and mystical dispute and stuff that fight over that game plan very well anyway. So the 4 fatal push, the Cling to Dusts are pretty bad, usually boarding those out. And then I might board out a Shieldred's Edict. I really don't like having multiple edicts because my game plan revolves around not letting one of those big things enter the battlefield. So I don't really want to build my game plan around dealing with one after it's already entered. I'd rather put all my resources towards not letting it enter in the first place. The Flash deck, really, really good into Neobrand as well because, again, Subtlety for Allosaurus Rider, all your counter spells for all of their Neoform effects. The post-board Ice Fang Oculus plan, I think it's a lot better into this deck than it is into the Fair Frog deck, because this deck doesn't really have the card advantage or the card advantage plus pressure engines to really start clocking your opponent while keeping your hand full. So it's a lot harder for this deck to fight over the early creatures with Ice Fangs and whatnot and the payoffs, because they're just not drawing the extra cards every turn. But the sideboard plan, pretty much the same. Consigned Memories, Mystical Disputes can come in. Graveyard Trespasser is fine if you just want extra pressure, extra threat, and you have enough stuff to board out. So bringing out the 4 Fatal Push, 2 Shieldred's Edicts, having access to 2 Consign, 3 Dispute, and the Trespassers, pretty easy, 6 for 6. The Oculus build, this is another deck that's not doing anything to disrupt the Unearth Thought Scour Oculus plan, so I leave all that in. Might board out the Graveyard Trespassers for Harbingers, but typically in Oculus, I try to leave all of the threats in a matchup like this so that you have the most potential to Surveil or Thought Scour over a creature on turn 1, Unearth on turn 2, plus Thoughtseize or plus Spell Snare, plus some piece of interaction to start getting a clock going, as well as keep the disruption up. So for a matchup like Neoform, the Mystical Dispute's definitely coming in, Harbinger's definitely coming in, any extra counter spells are coming in, Consigns, and then boarding out all for the Fatal Push, Stern Scolding, Strategic Betrayal can come out if you're on it instead of Shieldred's Edict, and then boarding out a couple Considers or something that doesn't help out your all-in Unearth plan, but just a subsidiary card. And usually that's enough to get a win against Neoform. They do have some fair draws that can give you a little bit of trouble with like multiple Veil of Summers. But for the most part, if you're just able to get reasonable pressure down, then like 2 or 3 pieces of disruption is typically enough. Because if they have a draw with like too many counter spells, so for example, Pact of Negations or Mystical Disputes or stuff like that, then Unearthing Inoculus, getting a frog down, whatever, just kind of runs away with the game because they don't have an opportunity to cast Allosaurus Rider and like present something that you need to answer. All they can really do is draw go and like let you fill up your hand and really filter. So that's it for Neoform. On to number 10. Number 10 is Prowess. And I also forgot to mention for the Neoform matchup before we really get into Prowess, if you're on the white splash, Teferi Time Raveler, really, really good. And High Noon is really, really good. So High Noon, letting you set up lines like your opponent's got a hard cast their Allosaurus Rider, but they can't Neoform it right away. And then next turn, they Neoform it. They can't counter back on your counter. So it gives you a lot of play there that you can kind of take advantage of. So High Noon, Teferi Time Raveler. On to Prowess. The Prowess matchup post board. Thoughtseize is very easy cut. Your life total obviously is a resource, but a limited resource when your opponent's trying to clock you with Quarry Steel Cutters and Slickshot show-offs. 3 Thoughtseizes, easy cut, and then I'll trim, like I'll cut Tameo, cut Kaito, and then trim on something like Quantum Riddler that's a little bit slower, a little bit grindier, because the game's not really going slow and grindy. And if it does, you're winning without needing Quantum Riddler. So I might trim like one of those. The board ends, the 2 Engineered Explosives, very, very easy. Ghost Vacuum or like any of my Grave Hate to help fight over Unholy Heats, Dragon's Rage Channelers, stuff like that. Any sweeper effects I'm likely to bring in, even if it's Toxic Deluge, because a Deluge for 3 to take out like Channeler, Swift Spear, 2 Quarry Steel tokens is going to save you a lot more life in the long run. Ideally, you don't have to use it, but it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. I mentioned the Grave Hate. Mystical Dispute is reasonable if you're willing to fight or if you're wanting to fight over like expressive iterations, but also because they're likely bringing in a bunch of counter magic of their own, like Spell Pierces, Spell Snares, Mystical Disputes on their side. So having a 1-mana counter for a lot of that stuff is really nice, especially when you get to spots where you need to fight over like a Quarry Steel Cutter. So Thoughtseize is out, Tameo's out, Kaito out, like a Quantum Riddler out, EE's in, Mystical Disputes in, Toxic Deluge in, Ghost Vacuum in. If you're on one of the splash options, for red, I'm probably not bringing in Meltdown just for Quarry Steel Cutter. They'd have to show me a little bit more. But white, like Pest Control's definitely coming in. High Noon's coming in. Rest in Peace, if you're on a build that's able to afford to run Rest in Peace, that can come in. The Flash build. Prowess, I think, is a very rough matchup for the Flash deck. You don't really have any bodies to get on board early to kind of stand in front of anything. Like Psychic Frog can do a really good job of coming down, ditching a couple cards, standing in front of a Swift Spear, or jumping to take out a Dragon's Rage Channeler. The Flash deck like doesn't have access to that at all. So you're a lot more dependent on your interaction being naturally drawn and lining up correctly. Unfortunately, the Prowess deck has like a lot of cheap threats to get on the board with, so it's really difficult for that interaction to line up effectively since you don't have something like Frog to help refill your hand as you're fighting over stuff. Pretty much same idea with sideboarding, like Fire Magic coming in if you're on Grixis. Otherwise, EE, Toxic Deluge, Graveyard Trespasser is really solid in the matchup. Mystical Dispute, boarding out Boarding out's a little bit tougher with this deck. Usually like some Consult the Star Charts, Kaito can come out. Bowmaster on the draw isn't as great. Wan Shi Tong can be a little bit slow and dies to Lava Dart, which is a big deal. So even if you Wan Shi Tong for like 5, they can Lava Dart with the trigger on the stack and kill it. You still get to draw your cards, but if Wan Shi Tong dies, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. So Wan Shi Tong, Bowmaster a little bit weaker. Consult the Star Charts a little slow. Graveyard Trespasser, Dispute, Fire Magic, all okay. For the Oculus build, this is a reasonable matchup. Oculus itself survives everything outside of Unholy Heat, and if your opponent does Unholy Heat your Oculus, you still have access to cards like Unearth to help get it back. Surgical Extraction is one you do need to keep an eye out for. It can be a blowout if you go for an Unearth after like Quarry Steel Cutter turn, and your opponent's able to like Surgical plus bolt you or something, make another token, as well as stop your Unearth. So typically don't want to go for Unearth if you're not in a spot where you can't afford to get Unearthed, but you can stop Surgical Extraction with Psychic Frog to save all of your other Oculuses in your deck. The sideboards, the 4 Thoughtseize is pretty easy cut, just like in the Fair Frog deck. Some number of Unearth or Oculus if your opponent's on a bunch of Surgicals or Tormod scripts. Couple copies of like Consider or Find to cut if you have enough stuff to bring in. EE, great. Mystical Dispute, great. The extra counters, if they're like Force Negation, Stern Scolding, anything like that's really solid. But the idea is just get down an Oculus, let the Oculus stand in front of like an opposing Slick Shot show off, let tokens build up to kind of clog the ground, and do whatever you can to keep an Oculus on board constantly. So unearthing if it dies to an Unholy Heat, fighting over removal on your Oculus, whatever the case may be. But if you're able to keep the eyeball itself on the battlefield, you have a really, really good chance of coming away with a win there. Let's see, sideboard. I already mentioned that Prowess is mostly bringing in like counters for our counters. The entire game for pretty much any of the Dimir decks against Prowess is Quarry Steel Cutter. It is really, really difficult to beat a Quarry Steel Cutter after it's resolved. If you're on a white splash with copies of something like Prismatic Ending, it gets a little bit better. But a lot of white lists aren't running Prismatic in any number, so kind of takes that one out of the equation. But you do have Spell Snare, Counterspell, Force Negation, some flash lists on like Spell Pierce, really good there. I would not worry so much about fighting over cards like Expressive Iteration. Yes, they're card advantage for your opponent, but the Expressive Iteration again isn't killing you. The creatures, the Quarry Steel Cutter are. So if you have the option to Spell Snare an Iteration, I would try to heavily consider not doing that and saving it for a Quarry Steel Cutter. Yeah, I guess that's about all we got for the matchups. So anyway, I had a lot of fun putting together this video and talking about sideboarding and all of these different matchups, the top 10 matchups according to Goldfish, and giving some tips and tricks. As always, this is not meant to be a you have to board in X and board out Y video. It's just a general companion idea. Like, these are the kind of things that have worked for me. This is what I've seen when I've run the matchups. This is where I'm comfortable with in my sideboarding based on the cards I typically play. But if you're playing something different, hopefully you can use a lot of these thoughts and ideas to kind of influence your own sideboarding decisions by hearing how games typically progress and helping or letting cards fall into place as to how they fit into that typical progression or game plan. If you have any questions, we do have a link down below to the Discord. I would love to have you over there to talk about everything you've got, whatever might be showing up, because as we enter RCQ season, there's going to be a lot of other people with similar questions, and the more answers we can kind of congregate into one area, the better we can help everybody who is looking at registering a fair Dimir deck in their upcoming RCQs. Other than that, come check us out over on YouTube if you want to see any of the recorded gameplays, or over at twitch.tv/the_control freak if you want to catch a live stream. We're there Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday from about 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. Central Time, and occasionally outside of those hours for challenges and other modern events. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your evening. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.